My second child had just entered the world when I noticed the midwife reaching for strips of material. Initially, her intentions were completely unclear to me. At 21 years of age, I was submerged in that profound, total depletion that follows childbirth, an exhaustion residing beneath conscious thought and language, far beyond the sharp alertness required to truly comprehend the surrounding room during those opening moments. My newborn son lay directly against my chest, radiating heat, vocalizing loudly, and possessing an immediate reality that completely replaced the abstract nature of the preceding 9 months of pregnancy. He was finally present, he belonged to me, and my gaze was fixed entirely on his small face. Suddenly, I sensed her hands manipulating my ankles, causing me to look down toward the foot of the bed. She had produced bands of fabric that were distinct from ordinary medical dressings and entirely unlike anything used during my initial delivery 14 months prior, which had occurred in this identical bedroom, under the care of this exact same woman, but without this particular ritual. She proceeded to bind my legs together with a calm, orderly focus, displaying the practiced, effortless efficiency of someone executing a routine task so deeply ingrained that it requires no active reflection. When I questioned her actions, she simply replied that the bishop required it, offering the explanation with her typical matter-of-fact delivery, conveying no sense that the procedure was unusual or that any elaboration beyond those 4 words was necessary. With that brief statement, she simply carried on with the binding. Now 67 years old, I have spent nearly 4 decades outside the Old Order community, having departed 38 years ago. It has taken me all this time to gradually piece together the true meaning of what transpired in that room on that autumn morning. This is the slow process of coming to terms with an action performed on your own flesh without your awareness or endorsement, an understanding that arrives incrementally and carries a heavy emotional toll. I am ready to fully disclose the events of that day, detailing the nature of the ritual, the underlying justification for the rule, the actual motive I eventually uncovered, and what it feels like at this stage of my life to finally speak these truths openly. For those experiencing this journey with me for the first time, I invite you to walk alongside me through everything that lies ahead, as this particular account required nearly half a century to finally surface. If this narrative resonates with you, please consider sharing it with others who might find meaning in it as we journey back to that specific September dawn. To truly understand, you must know the person I was before entering that bedroom, before encountering the midwife, the fabric, and the directive that would echo through my mind for 46 years. The young woman in that bed was not a generic statistic. She was a specific individual, and that distinct reality is what grounds this narrative in truth. For the purposes of this account, I will refer to myself as Martha. I was raised as the third of 7 offspring within a traditional Lancaster County district, embedded in a lifestyle where the daily routine was completely integrated and anchored entirely by faith, physical labor, and the careful filtering of external influences. Growing up in this environment, the structure felt less like a collection of restrictions and more like an entire landscape. The boundaries were the very terrain itself, not obstacles you collided with, but simply the reality you inhabited. I held a deep affection for my people and was a wholehearted participant in our way of life, genuinely embracing the doctrines and principles I was taught. The structure enveloping me felt like a protective benefit rather than a limitation, a perspective common among those who have only known a specific type of order, because the true nature of the walls enclosing you remains invisible until you step beyond them. I entered marriage at 19 to a 24-year-old farmer named Samuel, a solemn and highly regarded member of the community who walked with the steady assurance of a man dedicated entirely to fulfilling his prescribed duties. Samuel was not a cruel person, an assertion I make deliberately because the reality of our relationship is far more intricate than a simple narrative of a victim and a villain. Throughout my life, I have found that the complex truth is far more instructive than a simplified version. Samuel merely operated according to his training, just as I did, both of us navigating a system we had no hand in creating and were never permitted to evaluate. This societal framework possessed explicit mandates regarding the female anatomy, dictating its purpose, its obligations, the timing of those duties, and who held the authority to direct them, which included the specific postpartum protocols brought into my bedroom that morning. None of these practices had ever been revealed to me prior to my wedding day, not by my mother, my senior sisters who had already navigated their own deliveries, or the neighborhood women present at my first labor 14 months earlier. Even the midwife, who attended both of my deliveries, offered no warning or explanation before introducing the fabric during the second birth. The silence masking these practices was so absolute and carefully preserved that it points to a deliberate cultural design, not an explicit, coordinated plot, but the natural outcome of a society where intimate aspects of a woman's body are treated as the proper jurisdiction of leadership rather than the property of the women themselves. Within this structure, authority felt no obligation to explain itself. It simply issued dictates. The midwife reached our household at 7 o'clock that morning, my labor progressing with greater speed than the first time. My mother and mother-in-law were both in attendance, while my 14-month-old slept in the adjacent room. The delivery itself was brief and intense, lasting a mere 3 hours from her arrival until my infant was resting on my chest. She pronounced him healthy, noting his excellent color and robust cries, traits he would display consistently over the coming months, and then she immediately retrieved the fabric. These bands were fashioned from plain white cotton torn from a larger bolt, the standard material used for general wrapping and domestic necessities in a home operating apart from mainstream medical resources. They were entirely premeditated. She had packed them intentionally, fully aware of their purpose before crossing our threshold, yet she had kept them hidden from me. She proceeded to wrap my legs together from the lower joints up to just beneath my knees, and I want to emphasize that the wrapping was not done with constrictive malice or to the point of cutting off circulation. It was executed with a firm, holding pressure, ensuring I could not separate my limbs without a conscious struggle that would necessitate untying the fabric. She performed this task in absolute silence. My mother and mother-in-law remained in the room, neither offering a word of protest nor showing the slightest hint of astonishment. When I sought my mother's gaze, I found her eyes anchored firmly on the newborn, displaying the intense concentration of someone who had decided that focusing on the infant was the only appropriate choice. My mother-in-law maintained an identical posture, revealing that both of them possessed prior knowledge of this ritual, but had chosen to leave me in ignorance. Once finished, the midwife stood up, readjusted the lighting, and began organizing the space with her characteristic efficiency. When I pressed her on the purpose behind the binding, she merely repeated her statement about the bishop's decree, pausing briefly as if calculating the precise amount of information to disclose. She then asserted that the wrapping was essential for my physical restoration, claiming it prevented the body from expanding further after delivery and aided in proper closure. She delivered these explanations with the same neutral composure as her initial statement, presenting the concept not as a debatable tradition or a medical theory, but as in self-evident reality where the physical closing of the body and the religious mandate were inextricably linked, rendering further inquiry irrelevant. At 21, newly delivered of my child, and surrounded by compliance, I desisted from questioning. I was a product of a world designed to teach me that certain domains were beyond my right to challenge, where official decrees silenced dialogue before it could even begin. I remained there, immobilized and holding my infant, relegating that morning to the hidden internal repository where I kept all the unsettling experiences I lacked the vocabulary to articulate. These were the events you simply endured and never discussed, not because of an explicit prohibition, but because the collective silence maintained by your closest protectors signaled that speaking out would mean challenging the foundational order of things. The restraints remained in place for 3 full days. Years later, through guarded, indirect conversations with other women in our district who had endured similar deliveries, I uncovered the deeper reality behind that September morning. The bishop's decree was indeed an authentic policy traced directly back to Bishop Lab, communicated systematically to local practitioners, and executed across generations of births. The official rationale regarding physical recovery and historical postpartum wrapping practices provided a plausible veneer that a young mother could not easily challenge. However, the unvarnished truth operating beneath that sanitary explanation was far more systemic. The wrapping served as an instrument of physical enforcement rather than medical restoration, designed to ensure a period of waiting. A wife subjected to this binding was physically prevented from resuming intimate marital obligations until the fabric was removed, making it a community mechanism to police the postpartum interval. The policy was never genuinely about protecting the woman's health. It was about forcing the husband's compliance through physical management of the wife's anatomy. The midwife acted as the administrator, The religious leader provided the authority, and the woman whose body was being secured remained completely oblivious to the systemic architecture enclosing her. It reflects a social order that trusted neither the wife to assert her own physical limits nor the husband to respect them voluntarily. Consequently, the community implemented a physical barrier, utilizing a religious mandate and a 3-day constraint to enforce a boundary that should have been secured by simple mutual consent and respect. The woman was left isolated in her recovery bed, unversed in the true dynamics at play, aware only of the silence that had preceded her and her own exclusion from the truth of her situation. My departure from that life occurred at age 29, when the infant from that autumn morning was 8 years old. Today, he is 46 and fully acquainted with this history, as I shared it with him during his 30s after his own spouse delivered their firstborn within a modern medical facility, surrounded by professional care, advanced monitoring, and explicit informed consent. He listened in absolute stillness, and upon my conclusion, he offered a profound 6-word observation, stating simply that I should have been told why. Those words represent the most validation I have ever received regarding that day, emphasizing that regardless of the community's rules or the leader's perceived rights, my own body belonged to me, and I deserved to understand what was being done to it. I have regularly revisited that sentiment, contemplating how the entire experience would have shifted if any of the women present had simply chosen to explain the procedure, its duration, and its significance, treating me as an individual worthy of comprehension rather than a territory to be managed. While it wouldn't have dismantled the overarching system, transparency would have altered the nature of my endurance, replacing isolation and averted gazes with basic human dignity during a moment of profound vulnerability. Reconciling with this past has taken 46 years, a process distinct from offering blanket absolution, which I do not believe is required of me. Instead, it has been about finding a way to integrate this history without allowing it to overshadow my subsequent decades of freedom, the upbringing of my children in an environment of autonomy, and the lives of my grandchildren who inhabit a world closer to recognizing a woman's fundamental self-ownership. The memory remains a permanent part of me, but I carry it now with the hard-won peace that accompanies true articulation. Giving a name to an experience alters its power over you. These accounts do not culminate in tidy moral lessons, but in the unvarnished truth. A young woman was subjected to a physical intervention without explanation, enveloped in absolute silence by those she trusted, and carried that unspoken weight for nearly half a century until she finally found the voice to declare it openly. If your own life mirrors this struggle for autonomy, your insights and reflections are a vital part of this ongoing conversation, because breaking these silences is precisely why these truths must be spoken aloud.